everyone, and welcome back to another Half Pint session. So today on the show, we have a returning guest. He has been on the inaugural C.S. Lewis Reading Day live stream, but we haven't had him on the podcast or the YouTube channel yet. So it's about time. Stephen Burnett, welcome to the show.
David, looks like I'm flying solo this time. Great to be with you again and to share early morning beverages, even though all I have is this rather ordinary coffee left over in my new souvenir Blue Ridge Christian Writers Conference mug, which is surprisingly durable.
Well, possibly sometime this year we might have Pints for Jack ones, so I'll have to send you one so you can really impress everyone in your life.
Sounds like a plan.
And speaking of, this is a morning beverage, but I will also add this is a non-alcoholic beer because, I still have work to do today.
This is a non-alcoholic coffee.
But hopefully caffeinated. It's like decaf is just like wine.
Not that I need that sort of thing, but yes.
Well, for people who don't know you, who are you?
I'm Stephen Burnett. Hi, I'm the publisher of Lorehaven.com, which blends my enjoyment of journalism. I was a local journalist for many years, interviewing folks, but mostly exploring fantastical stories for God's glory. Lorehaven is a fan-centered resource. We are trying to grow the readership for these newer Christian-made novels in fantasy, science fiction, and supernatural, etc. genres. So toward that purpose, we have a weekly podcast of our own, Fantastical Truth, as well as weekly reviews of these stories that we like or love, and articles and other resources, including a Discord server. And most recently, my own science fiction debut, Above the Circle of Earth, launched in March 2025 from Enclave Publishing.
And I love that we're going to be talking about a book that you've written because I've recently been binging The Plunge, a podcast I recently found, and they did a 12-part series on Owen Barfield. And one of the things that one of the guests brought up is that anyone that regards themselves a fan of the Inklings, in order to actually really love the Inklings, you actually have to do what the Inklings did, and that includes writing books. So let's hear about yours. Where did this book come from? What's it about?
Well, got to follow the Lewis template here, don't we all? And of course, that means that I wanted to say something about Christianity to readers. And so I decided that science fiction is the most popular genre right now to do that. No, of course, that is not what I did at all. I looked back over the creative process, which really goes back off and on 25 years. So this is not a 25-year project. I've simply been working on this science fiction story off and on for about 25 years. And it really goes back to a rather germ of an idea. Hey, why can't Christians do science fiction? Which is a rather cheesy origin. And fortunately, I outgrew that and started to read and watch more science fiction, get more familiar with the genre. But really, it comes down to the theme of how could a Christian citizen of the future in the next century of this world explore strange new worlds while also protecting his family. Now, that's some familiar themes to science fiction fans, particularly of the space exploration variety of science fiction. But I haven't seen that really done before from a unique biblical Christian vantage. And so I saw this hero, Brock Rivers, who is a young husband. He was exiled from Earth under circumstances involving religious persecution of the 22nd century. And he has to fight to be a repairman on Mars, a job he never wanted, in order to protect his family. And then 7 years later, time is running out. The cause, the humanistic space regime that governs all the solar system, is gradually taking over more of Mars, pushing out, encroaching upon those freedoms. So his only hope, his family's only hope, is to return to the home world as best they can and start the first space missionary outreach to go above the circle of Earth, to follow Christ's command to go therefore, not just into all the world, but now into all the worlds. Their opposition will not only be that one world humanistic cause, which would prefer that Christians and all other competitor religions remain balkanized on the home world, but also a lot of opposition from other Christians, some of whom have gotten very comfortable under that arrangement and would prefer not resisting that status quo. So about partway through, it turns into just a straight up science fiction action thriller, espionage, intrigue, battles, like some of the classic stuff that you would enjoy from science fiction, but with definitely a bit of a different thematic emphasis than you will see from other sci-fi.
Yeah, when I was describing it to my wife, I said it's sort of like the Puritans in space, there and back again.
Something like that. I describe it as the Book of Acts meets Star Trek, or a sci-fi action thriller, because you got some of those questions like Star Trek has,
Mhm.
but not some of the wackiness that people assume. This is not an alien story. This is meant to be a very deeply human story about deeply human choices, where all the tech and all the cool stuff that's there, but it's running on the lower deck of the ship. So if you're a nerd and you like getting into that, you can go down, poke around, ask me about my 2 Martian calendars. But it ought to be a deeply human story, which is something that I favor across all of the genres. It's a focus on humanity from that biblical vantage.
Mm. What does recasting this sort of story in a futuristic sci-fi world, what does that actually do to the story and the way that the message is received?
It's a playing out of current trends. And when I started working on it, I didn't even know that was going to happen. But literally last week, there's Elon Musk, who's been in the news lately for some less savory reasons. But last week, he was all aspirational. He was in aspirational Musk mode, TM,
Mm-hmm.
talking about Mars and making all kinds of grandiloquent promises about putting robots on Mars. And next, we're going to put rocket ships on Mars and scale upward. And all of the tonnage and all of the supplies he wants to send to Mars, all for the goal of making life multiplanetary. And it's a good goal. It's a humanistic goal. And I appreciate that from that perspective of God's original command to be fruitful and multiply and steward creation on behalf of God. But Musk himself is godless. Biblical virtues, such as he adopts them very selectively, are only for the purpose of making life multiplanetary, just as money for him is only for the purpose of making life multiplanetary, according to what he said. So a lot of this now, I'm starting these conversations and talking about the story of Above the Circle of Earth because these are issues that are happening now. Like David, I believe you and I will actually live to see humans land on Mars, not just Tesla bots. And at that point, science fiction will become fact. And although I love fantasy, that kind of sci-fi is more likely to become fact. So yeah, it's a story, it's fun, it's adventure, but it's specifically about getting us ready for those kinds of questions and even those kinds of realities in our future come to life in the present.
And it's quite amazing that even Lewis spoke about this back in the 40s when we were even further away. You know, they'd barely started any kind of space program, and he's already wrestling with some of the questions that you're addressing here in terms of what does that do to the faith when we start going to other planets, both in terms of what we should do, what we can do, how we handle the native populations as we come in as the invaders, but really, you know, his question is, you know, will we lose God in outer space?
Almost certainly. If you read Out of the Silent Planet, some of the Musk style rhetoric, and understand, I appreciate what he's doing,
It is a very on
an
the
exact
nose.
hybrid between Weston and Divine. He's like right in between. Now, lately, I don't see him going the Dr. Weston route and then calling upon the macrobes on the surface of Paralandra
Yet.
yet. But that is what Lewis foresaw, right? Is understanding that this secular materialist view irrevocably bends back toward the pagan. The materialist may eventually become a materialist magician and then just a simple magician all at once. I mean, Weston is that materialist magician. Uncle Andrew is a more meddling version of the materialist magician. That archetype seems to have haunted Lewis's villain characters and a lot of the stuff that he was talking about, like you said, as far back as the 40s. Such a prescient fellow, wasn't he?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Um, I remember it was quite a few years ago. I remember Jimmy Akin did a podcast, and he asked the similar sorts of questions, but it was much more from a Catholic point of view in terms of just like how do we do a liturgical calendar in space? Which planet do we go with? How do you celebrate the liturgy in zero gravity? From your point of view, what do you think space travel does to Christianity, and also how do you see that playing out in your book?
Well, there's technicalities, of course, in that once you go beyond Earth, the calendar, forces of gravity, all of that, simple directional up and down, the further out you go and the more you speculate about, okay, let's say we actually go past the moon, we're now out into the deeper solar system without Earth and those familiar sites to orient us, even in theory. Once you go out further, I'm sure that it can be very easy to become something of a relativist. If up is no longer up and down is no longer down, I can imagine what would happen in the human psyche if you spend that much time out there. But even settling on another world, for example, I was just at a homeschool conference the last, I think it was the last full weekend of May, and sold a lot of books there, which is fantastic. But I was able to start a lot of conversations because I have my T-shirt now that says "Evangelize Mars." Start some great conversations. Go therefore into all the worlds and preach the gospel, right? And so people would laugh and they'd ask about it, like you just did, and I would offer a bit of random fact about Mars, and I would ask, do you want to hear about the gravity, the calendars, or the population? And so you asked about the calendars, and so I want to do my bit. And if people say calendar,
I thought you would take that bait.
If people say calendar, I say, well, the Martian year is approximately twice the length of an Earth year, give or take a few days, which on Mars are called sols. Interestingly enough, sols. It may do something about that. But that does.
But they spell it in the American way. They drop the U.
SOLS. Correct. Yes. Sol as in sun, which Lewis renames in his Ransom trilogy. We'll call it the Ransom trilogy. I'll be a nerd about that. But I then say, if that Martian calendar is twice the length of an Earth year, where do you put Christmas and Easter? Then I segue into the sci-fi. I say, well, if you are the cause, the secular space regime that governs the planet, then it's really not an issue. You're not going to celebrate Christmas and Easter. You're not even going to do the abbreviated liturgical calendar as reflected in the popular culture. You just celebrate the science. Like all the months are named after the scientists or different Greek mythological figures, and everything gets turned around. It's a new world. You can remake everything, including your religion. Why wouldn't you? Leave everything on Earth behind and then just reboot humanity on Mars, especially if you're only taking the best and brightest. And so a lot of that goes in my story world, even though a bunch of the first book is set on Earth, on the home world.
And in a 1984-esque style, you also have to rewrite the history. So if you are, say, honoring scientists each month, you got to make sure you don't use the religious ones like Georges Lemaitre, the person who first put forward the Big Bang Theory, or Mendel. I think it's Mendel, the father of modern genetics. But the Christianity has a long, very storied history of scientists, and so you'd have to forget about all of those.
Well, there's the myth, of course, of Galileo versus the Pope and all of that sort of thing. And we've already got some historical revisionism happening there. Newton's, at least his deism, is certainly going to go by the wayside. And we're only going to talk about his calculus and all of that. It's already happening, the secularization. And yet that's the backdrop of the story. We need to take these things as a given in order for the story world to work. We're not saying, hey guys, atheism is bad. Like, okay, let's say that's already a given. But now, I mean, almost like the heroes of That Hideous Strength. Okay, now what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go to war, or are we going to seek a significant influence? Like, how does that work, especially when this environment will kill you physically as well as spiritually? How can you do this, fulfill your calling, and yet also protect your family?
And for your character with the idea of evangelizing the galaxy, why does he receive some pushback from some Christians?
Well, for the same reason that some today may feel nervous about certain strategies to reach the lost. In this case, it's not about a particular strategy. Do you lead with law or grace? Do you start a conversation in a relationship, or do you stand on a street corner with a bullhorn? Like, all of those approaches may work for different settings at different times. Here, it's simply a fact that in the preserved system of the 22nd century, secular society rules all the planets, or all of Earth, certainly, and it's just expected. There's the civil area, which is the main world, and then Christians and members of other religions are basically isolated in these legal districts called preserves. And thinking about it, I realized this could be the least worst thing that happens with the increasing reach of secularization. There are some benefits. For example, I got rid of the sexual revolution completely because it just sidelines any project of human expansion if we're constantly sitting around contemplating our own navels. Like, I just rule that out as an ingredient in the story world. And so now it's simply a case that if you are a biblical Christian, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or anything else, or a member of another religion, you can just join your people in this geographic area. You can raise your family, join a church, go to school. You're safe and secure And there's no incentive whatsoever for cultural Christianity. Why would you do that? Just go out and join the regular world. So everybody kind of lines up on different sides and you're safe. So what happens then if someone realizes, this isn't working out for us? We are in defiance of God's calling. We are supposed to engage the world. And there's all these people out there, out in our world and in the other settled worlds in our solar system, who've never met a Christian, who don't know the name of Jesus, who don't know this amazing, even from their own perspective, this element of the human story that's being denied to them. You mentioned the historical revisionism. So no, we need to be mixing it up. We need to risk even those conflicts. We don't need to be balkanized. And that's what makes some of the Christians, God bless them, I love the church wherever she may be found, but it makes some of the Christians in my world quite nervous, and even raises a lot of intense opposition from Brock's Home Preserve.
Yeah, Jesus tells us to be salt and light, but a diet of nothing but salt wouldn't actually be that tasty. We're called to be added to other interesting food and bring out its taste. And the idea of what is effectively a ghetto of religious communities, I think there's certainly enough historic data that can also be exceptionally dangerous for the health and well-being of those groups, both when they go about their business unchecked and uninfluenced by anything else. There's sort of a claustrophobia that sort of seems to set in, but also a kind of false security, because you end up with the just being carried along on the stream. And then at the moment of testing, you realize you actually don't have anything yourself that you're actually standing on.
Agreed. One of the slightly formative influences of this story was Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, or at least the misconceptions of his book. Yes. A lot of people, particularly those...
I'm a big fan. If anybody took what I just said as
no, I'm also a fan.
I love that book.
No, and just for clarity, my reading of Dreher is that he's advocating for spirited, robust faith communities within geographical spaces or otherwise that are training one another for engagement. I mean, that involves some sheltering. I mean, I co-authored a book called The Pop Culture Parent, so I agree with that to an extent, but it's for the purpose of training. And that's the key there. We're not just living in this one area or living as Christians in a preserve for the sake of going on doing that. We are hoping to expand outward. And that's kind of the whole theme of some science fiction, is that outward expansion. And yet some people will push back on that and say, well, that's evil, especially if you're a Christian doing that. You ought not do that. This is the presumed secular neutral space. And that's exactly what Dreher is seeking to combat. But some people from some of those sheltered worldviews, they read Dreher or a surface treatment of his book and said, well, you just want to make more Christian ghettos, and haven't we had enough of that sort of thing? I don't read that Dreher was advocating for that at all.
No, I completely agree. I think that was a serious misread. And I doubt people that really put that forward have really read it, because I'd heard of that conception, that I'd heard of that portrayal of the book before I read it. And
Same.
I bet he doesn't mean this. This doesn't sound right. And then as I'm reading it, it's like, no, like every couple of pages, he's making it really clear that this isn't an isolated community for themselves. They are preserving something. They are building something, and it's for the purpose of those who are on the other side of the walls, so to speak.
Right. Well, that's kind of the crossover between Above the Circle of Earth and the Lorehaven project. Is Lorehaven cultivates an audience for Christian-made fantastical novels. We'll occasionally engage with secular movies and such. I used to do a lot more of that in my past, secular movie reviews, engaging the pop culture and such. However, I think that field has gotten a little crowded. I think we have plenty of Christians already doing that, and that is marvelous, and I support them. What I see less of is Christians finding the best of what we are doing as spiritual family members to create stories, particularly fantasy, sci-fi, and the like. And so Lorehaven exists to exalt those stories. If a story is not good, we're probably not going to review it. We only review stuff that we like or love and leave other things on the shelf. But we want to find the best stuff. We want to extol that and train people to enjoy that for the purpose of cultural engagement, but mostly for the purpose of glorifying God. Reading is an act of worship, not just singing in church or hearing a sermon or studying doctrine. I have had many Christian-made stories that God has used to draw me closer to him, to his truth, to his beauty, to his goodness, and even the newer stuff, even the simpler stuff that's certainly not as literary as Lewis. I wouldn't say that any of this is in the tradition of the Inklings. I've seen a few authors who want to think that, and I go, well, if you have studied like the original medieval and Renaissance literature in their own languages and can write in those languages and make casual references to Beowulf and the North legends and all of that, things that I cannot do, then you can say that you're in the tradition of the Inklings. But I don't think we have to be all in their tradition, although Tolkien and Lewis and et al. Were certainly pioneers in that space and will probably always remain the greatest as the founding fathers of Christian-made fantasy.
And also, not every book has to be Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings very nearly wasn't for that reason, because it was epic in every possible sense of the word. And there are other stories that can be just as impactful that don't have to follow that mold.
And even if they're at the popular level, Lewis himself, you know this probably more than I do, he read popular level fiction, including science fiction. I was rereading.
Loved the pulp stuff. Yeah.
He loved the pulp stuff for what it was, and yet understood the potential. I was recently rereading his essay on science fiction, where he talks about, I mean, he would have surely been reading the original John Carter stories and the ones with the robot carrying around the woman on another planet, and the Swords and Planets serializations and such. And yet he saw potential for those stories to grow further and actually live to see that as they branched out into the dystopian novels and some of the more finer space travel type stories. But I always appreciate that essay because he has a lot of thoughts about criticism and how, people weren't criticizing sci-fi when it was pulp, but now that it's aiming a little higher, oh, here come the critics. I've noticed this, by the way, with superhero movies. It's startling how his observations about one trend back then totally map onto trends that we see nowadays. And so he's defending the genre and he's saying, don't criticize a thing for what it wasn't even trying to be. And then he breaks it down and he's got subcategorizations because he says, I've done my homework. I read this stuff. And he says the only type of sci-fi he doesn't like is the type of sci-fi, air quotes, where you could transpose the story into any era and it's essentially the same. At that point, the sci-fi really hasn't affected it at all. It's a kind of a poser. My words, not his.
Yeah, he also says elsewhere about if you want to judge a corkscrew or cathedral, you got to know what they're for first. Because if you don't know what they're trying to achieve, how could you possibly say whether or not they have achieved that?
Exactly. And so that's what we try to do at Lorehaven. We're judging these stories based on their own goals, basic genre expectations, vocabulary, accessibility. If it's a YA novel, I don't expect it to be literary. If it's a novel for grown-ups, I expect the themes to be a little bit more complex, but still fairly accessible because the young adult genre is kind of actually pulling expectations in that way. Maybe you've noticed, I even had a few reviews of my book. It was like, well, this isn't YA, so I don't know what to do with it. And I thought, but it's not meant to be. Like literally my publisher, Enclave, they have a different book size for YA titles and they have an imprint, Enclave Escape. It's a Christian run company. They do great stuff. But this novel is a rare example of a novel with grown-up characters that is meant to be for grown-ups. You can't say adult fiction anymore, oddly enough. It's rather unfortunate. The pejorative meaning of the term now, adult.
Well, before we wrap up, a couple more questions I've got. I do want to address this because of your work with Lorehaven and the things that we mentioned in passing about other works that do what you were trying to achieve and do some of the goals of the Inklings as well. What are a handful of other works that you have impacted you personally?
Oh, certainly Lewis and Tolkien. Their entire canon. I know we know that already. So let's talk about the less popular stuff. All right, the stuff that I grew up with. The first work that affected me was a Christian anime series in the 80s called Superbook, which featured, among other things, children and a time-traveling robot going back to Bible days. It is a thing that exists. It was easy to miss. I found that a lot of people miss it, but this to me was my first fantastical fiction and right alongside biblical fiction. And some people may struggle with that. They're adding a robot to scripture. There's no, now that's the remake. All right. There's a CGI remake, but if type Superbook 1980s, then you'll see it. That'll pull it up there. Yep. That is a real thing that happened. And my
Oh my
favorite one
goodness!
there
And
is
a clear Catholic invasion. The robot is made to look like a
oh,
cardinal.
look at that. He's got he totally looks like well he literally calls himself a crusader robot in the dub. It's the dub cast of Kimba the White Lion, by the way. The original series was more simply animated, and then there was a sequel series that actually delved further into the biblical narratives and fleshed them out. You know, David wouldn't get just a 25-minute episode. Now he's got an arc of like 5 episodes. So there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that they brought to the screen, and that was my first exposure. Then there was Adventures in Odyssey, a Christian-made audio drama.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of Lewis influence with the creators, and I've had the blessing of getting to know some of the folks who made that and basically helped shape me. So there's a perk of the job I hadn't counted on. And then there were some early Christian supernatural thrillers that did what they set out to do. Frank Peretti, even the Left Behind series with its interesting
Really?
American eschatology there, arguably.
Yeah, I like God. I can't do this.
That's okay. You don't have to. I was there for it was what I apparently needed at the time. It was my first internet fandom. So then internet conversation about the stories gets into it and waiting on release dates and all of that. But from there, the superhero movies were getting a bit better, a little bit more accessible to some homeschooled type nerds like me. Spider-Man, Superman, like some of those guys. Again, popular
The
level
Phantom.
entertainment, but still stuff that got to me for whatever reason. And so I guess I live in that space where I like to read the more complicated guys and thick books when I can get them. And Lewis, although for his time, of course, writing more popular level, it was just a more educated class of readers back then than we are now.
Yeah.
It just feels way, way higher for me. But I've read The Discarded Image and all of that stuff, so I can't read the original language like him, but I want to go as far as I can in that direction while still keeping my foot in that popular level, because I think that is what Christ did to us. He emptied himself of his glories. He stooped. He incarnates. He comes to earth. He dwells among us, and then someday he'll bring all of new heaven to join new earth and live with us again. So that's where I want to be with Lorehaven, making those things as accessible as possible, but for the glory of God with fantastical fiction.
And what is next for you and Lorehaven?
Well, with Lorehaven, we're going to keep going. The Realm Makers Expo is in July. That's a big event for Christian creators of fantasy, sci-fi, and such. Some big names going to be there. SD Smith, the folks who make the Wingfeather Saga TV show, and us at Lorehaven. We're going to have a corner booth this time, kind of split between Lorehaven and Above the Circle of Earth. So if this episode releases before July 18th through 20th, then come check us out. We're at Grand Rapids, Michigan. You just go to lorehaven.com and we'll have more info posted about that. But that's the site to follow, really, lorehaven.com, and subscribe free. You get podcast updates, reviews. Keep up with that stuff. Even if the books we're reviewing aren't for you, they are probably going to be for a teen, a YA, or a loved one of some kind. Lots of parents, lots of individuals now have lots of questions about the types of books that they're allowing in public libraries. And they keep getting the books from the public libraries and going, oh, this is awful. This is terrible. This book has agenda. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, you either read with discernment or maybe come read a more wholesome Christian-made story that's just as good, if not better. So we review those at Lorehaven. And then from there, you can also find my own website, estephenburnett.com, where I will be announcing anything I have to say about the future of the space mission and the Above the Circle of Earth novel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
David, thanks for having me on board your ship. Hopefully it won't be too hard of too far of a distance to travel back to the home world, but you can just drop me off there at the next port. Appreciate it.
Will do. And to the other passengers aboard, please join us again next time. And we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.
Further up and further in.